Revelation 11:1 says, "And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses. They shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." Now, we've been preaching through the book of Revelation for several months now. The book of Revelation is a prophetical book describing the judgments that God would pour on this planet during the time period called the Tribulation. We're well into the book of Revelation now, chapter number 11, which means we're well into the time period of the Tribulation. It lasts for 7 years. We're well into that 7-year period now. We're into the second set of judgments, the judgments that most often we just refer to as the Trumpet Judgments. And we're actually looking at part of the 6th trumpet judgment. It started back at Revelation chapter 9, verse number 13. That judgment and its effects, its after effects, and its co-effects, all that's related to it, will go all the way through to Revelation chapter 11, verse 14. So this is one prolonged judgment. Lots of things are happening during this judgment. It started back at Revelation 9:13, going to the end of the chapter. That's where, when the trumpet sounded, 4 angels came out of the river Euphrates. I believe they're demons. And they amassed an army of 200 million somethings. All right? And we've already looked at that. It's hard to know for sure what these things were, but 200 million some things. And between these 4 angels and these 200 million some things, this army, they will slay 1/3 of the world's population. That's an astonishing figure. That's not a guess. That's not an estimate. That's not a projection. That's a fact. They will destroy 1/3 of the world's population. Last week we looked at Revelation chapter number 10. Among the many things that Revelation 10 talks about, it talks about 7 thunders thundering. There's no reason to think this group of 7 is any different from any of the other groups of 7 that have been revealed to us in the book of Revelation. So far we've had 7 seals. We're talking about 7 trumpets. When we finish the 7 trumpets, we'll talk about 7 vials. All of these 7s are judgments. So more than likely, those 7 thunders were 7 more judgments that were poured out upon the earth. John was forbidden for writing what happened when he heard those thunders, but more than likely, there are 7 more judgments upon the planet. And then beginning in Revelation chapter number 11, we have 3 measurements, hence the title of this morning's message. I won't have the time this morning even to get to all 3 of these verses, but I do want to point out that in all 3 of them, there's measurements. In verse number 1, John is commanded to measure the temple. In verse number 2, the measurement for how long the time of the Gentiles is given. It'll be 42 months. In verse number 3, the measurement for the time of ministry for the 2 witnesses is given. It's 1,260 days. So the first 3 verses of this particular chapter all deal with measurements. As I said, won't have time to talk about all of it. Let's just look primarily this morning at verses 1 and 2. 3 thoughts to share with you this morning. Would you notice, number 1, as you're looking at verse number 1, there is a temple. There is a temple. Look at the last part of verse number 1. It says, the command of the angel to John, "Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and them that worship therein." So the measurement is there, and John's being commanded to measure the temple, the altar, and the people that are worshiping inside the temple. However, I can tell you up front that God's purpose in having this temple measured or in giving this command was not to find the measurements of the temple. The command is, go measure it. But God's purpose was not to get the measurements of the temple. Not for him, not for John, not for us. You say, "Preacher, what makes you say that? God gave the command, go measure it. Why doesn't God want to know the measurements?" Not necessarily sure why he didn't do this, but one thing is for sure, he didn't record the measurements in this verse. As a matter of fact, you can read through the entire book of Revelation. And although he commanded John to go and to measure the temple, the measurement is never given. As a matter of fact, the Bible never actually records that John didn't make the measurement. Now, maybe he did, but the Bible never records John using that reed that's in his hand and him going out and measuring the temple and the altar and the people. That tells me something. That tells me that God is less concerned about the measurement and more concerned about the object that he sent John to measure. The key here is not the measurement. God didn't record the measurement. What God's trying to emphasize in this verse is there is a temple to be measured. Now, maybe you know this and maybe you don't, but when John wrote this particular book, there was no temple. John wrote this book somewhere around 80 or 90 AD, 80 or 90 years after the birth of Jesus Christ. We know from history that the temple had been destroyed before that. The Jews were under Roman occupation, and they were a rebellious lot. They weren't just rebellious against God, they were rebellious against everybody. And they rebelled one too many times against the Jews in a rebellion that lasted from 66 AD to 70 AD. And I know you're not concerned with those dates, but in that time period, they rebelled one too many times. And so the emperor sent a general by the name of Titus to Jerusalem. He said, I want you to quell that rebellion. And the way he did it was, he destroyed the Jewish temple. Literally, he completely destroyed the Jewish temple so that there was not so much as one stone left upon the other. Interesting, Jesus prophesied this event. In the book of Matthew chapter 24, don't turn, but in Matthew 24, verse number 1, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the building of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all of these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now Jesus was walking through the temple somewhere around 30, 32, 33 AD. The disciples are patting themselves on the back saying, look what a beautiful temple we've got here. And Jesus said, it's not going to stand for very long. Before long, there won't be one stone left upon the other. That happened in the year 70 AD. Been my joy to go to Israel twice. The stones are still there, scattered about. Now, when the Bible talks about stones in the temple, it's not talking about bricks. It's not talking about the kind of stones like slab stones maybe we would build around a fireplace or maybe we would use for a foundation. They're huge boulders. They're square blocks of mountain that have been cut out, that weigh literally tons. But yet these stones have been pried apart and scattered and strewn all about where the temple used to be because the Jews were an instinctively rebellious people, and the Roman emperor said, I've had enough of that. You'd think they might have learned their lesson, but they really did not. In the year 135 AD, a different Roman emperor dealing with a different rebellion of the Jews sent his army, and this time they didn't just break apart the things that were there, but they took the land away from the nation of Israel. I mean from the whole nation. They didn't just confiscate farms or houses. They expelled the Jews out of the land. And the emperor made a declaration, if I find a Jew anywhere in that land, I will either imprison him or I will kill him with a very cruel death. From the year 135 AD until 1948, Israel had no nation. And from the year 70 AD to this present date, Israel has no temple. But this verse is a prophecy. And this verse is telling us one of these days there's going to be a temple. The message here is not about the measurement. The message here is God's going to rebuild His temple. Might I just share with you, things are already underway for the Jews to rebuild their temple. In the year 1948, because the Jews had been so persecuted by the Germans, by the Nazis, and because they had helped so much in the defeat of Hitler, some of the greatest minds working during that time period to produce weapons and to defeat Hitler were Jewish minds. Because of all they had endured and all they did, the United Nations decided to give them back their land. I say give it back. They expelled some of the folks that lived inside of it, but the Jews had to fight to keep it, and they've had to fight to keep it every day since. But the Jewish nation was born again, and almost immediately the Jews started making plans to build their temple. You can verify everything I'm about to tell you. You can go to a website. It's called the Jewish Temple Institute. Those people, they're Jews, have already reassembled and trained the future priest of their temple. How they did that, I don't know. Because to my knowledge, they don't even know who is from the tribe of Judah and who is not. But somehow they have amassed and already trained their priests. They've already woven the holy garments for them to wear. You can see the pictures of the garments that these priests will one day wear on their website. They have already made the instruments. You read through your Old Testament, you read about these golden and brass tools that these priests use, and you wonder why in the world did God record all this boring stuff for us so that the Jews could remake them all. And the Jews have remade their brass tools and their golden tools, and you can see pictures. About 5 years ago, I was doing some research on this, and I saw the brazen altar, the new brazen altar, being picked up with a crane and loaded on the back of a gigantic truck as it was being transported from one place to the other. To be honest, I'm not sure that's a wise way to transport God's brazen altar. David did something like that once, and as a result, some folks died. But God didn't strike anybody dead on that day. They moved the brazen altar to a place where it could be reverenced at and could be stored in the temple as built. There, at this moment, they're in the process of trying to build a red heifer farm, a red heifer herd. And you say, what in the world do they need a red heifer for? Might not know it, but if you go back and read through the book of Exodus, the first animal that was slain was the red heifer. And they took the red heifer, offered it to God, and then they took the ashes and put it in water. Sometimes the Pope talks about holy water. He ain't got none, okay? But the Jews, they had real holy water, and it was sanctified by the ashes of the red heifer. So the Jews are growing a herd of red heifers so that whenever they're able to get their land back and be able to erect their temple, they'll have a heifer right at hand so they can slay it and offer it and make holy water and begin to sanctify this altar that was on the back of that truck. Sanctify these tools, sanctify these priests, sanctify all these instruments so that they can build their temple yet again. It all started in 1948. Some of us have been around for about that long, but even if you have not, if you were around on December the 6th, 2017, President Donald Trump, recognized as the capital of the nation of Israel, the city of Jerusalem. He moved it from Tel Aviv, had a building built, said from now on we will recognize the capital of Israel as its true capital, Jerusalem. The reason no other president has ever done that is because that land is still claimed in part by Palestinians and by Muslims. Donald Trump, whether you like him or not, he tends to do things and he doesn't worry about the consequences. And in December the 6th, 2017, that, my friend, was a major step towards putting the nation of Israel back together again. Get this, you and I and the Jews are all waiting on the same thing. They don't know it, but we're all waiting on the rapture of the church. When the church is raptured, the Antichrist will have a part in making a treaty with the nation of Israel. And when that happens, they'll get their land back. And that temple I believe, that temple that they've got all of these tools, all of these people, all of these instruments already prepared and ready to go, will be put together, I believe, in just a few weeks or perhaps a few months. And the Jews will have their temple, first time since 70 A.D. And you and I might well be alive during that time period. Now, I can't promise you for sure. Prophecy is a tricky thing. I can't promise you for sure that the priest that they've got in Israel will be the priest of the first temple. I can't promise that. I can't promise that those garments will ever be worn. I can't promise those tools will ever be used. I can't promise that the herd of red heifers that they're gathering will ever be offered. But I can tell you, based on the book of Revelation, chapter 11, verse number 1, that they're going to get their temple back. That's the message that God was giving by telling John to go and measure it. Go and measure the temple. Number one, there is a temple. Number two, would you notice, there is 3.5 years. There is 3.5 years. Now, I know, especially the last few weeks, since chapter number 9 especially, I keep telling you that we're getting awful close, chronologically in this book, to the midpoint of the tribulation. The reason I brought it up so many times is because the judgments that God is giving are going to last for a while. This army that goes out and slays 1/3 of the world's population, the Bible says it's going to last for something like 13 months. So it may well start on the first half of the tribulation, but if it's going to last that long, chances are very good it will still be happening in the second half of the tribulation. So I've been talking to you much here lately about we're getting very near, if not crossing over the boundary of the midpoint of the tribulation. You need to understand, the middle of the tribulation is a very important time. It's important because some important events take place during that time. We know a good bit about the tribulation, not really from the New Testament, but from the Old Testament. Several months back now, I actually preached a message, and I went back into the Old Testament to the book of Daniel, chapter number 9, especially verse number 27, because that's the place where we learn that the tribulation is going to be 7 years long. We don't learn that from the New Testament. We learn that from the Old Testament. There in Daniel chapter number 9, verse number 27, there's a prophecy by Daniel of a treaty being signed that will last, and our King James uses the word 7 weeks, 7 periods of weeks. But the word there just means a period of 7. And I think it's pretty clear, if you go back and study what's taking place, he's describing a treaty between the prince of this world, who is the Antichrist, and the Jews that will last not for 7 weeks, but for 7 years. I don't care whether we're talking about weeks, months, decades. If you take 7 and divide it in half, you know what you got? 3.5. All right? So we know from the Old Testament that the tribulation is going to be divided into 2 parts. Something's going to happen in the middle of the tribulation. The whole tribulation is bad. There's not a good day in the whole 7 years, okay? It's all bad. But Jesus in the book of Matthew chapter 24, verse number 21, refers to the last half of the tribulation as the Great Tribulation. So it's all going to last for 7 years. All of it's bad. But in the middle of the tribulation, at the 3.5 year mark, something bad is going to happen that's going to cause it to be even worse in the last half than it was in the first half. Now you're at the book of Revelation chapter 11. You notice some times given in verse number 2 and again in verse number 3. In verse number 2, it tells us that the times of the Gentiles will be 42 months. You know how long 42 months is in years? 3.5 years. And then in verse number 3, it talks about the time of ministry for the 2 witnesses. How long will the ministry of the 2 witnesses last? The time is 1,260 days. Now you may not know this, but in the Hebrew calendar, every month has the same number of days in it. Every month, doesn't matter what month you pick in the Hebrew calendar, it always has 30 days in it. They don't have a leap year like we do. And they don't mix up their dates, 28, 29, 30, 30. They don't do that. Every month has 30 days. What they do is every once in a while, when it's needed, they stick a whole extra month into their calendar. On the Hebrew calendar, some years will have 13 months, and that's how they keep their calendar in sync with the movement of the sun. But every Jewish month has 30 days in it. So you take that figure, 1,260, and you divide it by 30. And you know how many months you got? 42 months. You know how many years 42 months is? 3.5 years. Do you see that number appearing over and over and over again? What does it mean? It means we're getting very, very, very close to the middle of this 7-year tribulation. Number 1, I want you to notice there's a temple. Number 2, I want you to notice there is 3.5 years. And then number 3, I want you to notice, there is a major event. There is a major event. Now, I thought about how to say this, and I don't want to say it in a way that makes me look foolish and makes me seem to be impairing God's ability. But I'm almost thinking as I read through this verse that God may be kind of misdirecting our attention a little bit. For example, we just looked at, he tells John to go measure, but he never records the measurements. I don't think the measurement is what's important. I think the building he was being sent to measure is important. But then also, in this verse, he talks about, in verse number 2, the temple. However, he slides into the conversation a statement about the holy city. That makes me think it's not just the temple that he wants us to be looking at. It's also the holy city itself that he wants us to be looking at. And in this verse, he tells John to go measure certain things in verse number 1. The temple, the altar, and the people. But then he adds in verse number 2, there's some things I don't want you to measure. And the thing he says I don't want you to measure is the outer court. I'm not so sure, but he's kind of misdirecting our eyes a little bit. He's pointing us in one direction, but at the same time, there's something bigger that he's telling us about something else. For example, the measurements, not so important. Temple, very important. The fact that he says go measure the temple, go measure the altar, go measure the people, I'm not sure that's nearly as important as what he tells John not to measure. In verse number 2, look at the verse. I'll be there as soon as my little computer catches up. Verse number 2, he says, but the court which is without the temple leave out and measure it not. Why? For it is given unto the Gentiles. Now he told John what to measure, but then he turns around and tells them what not to measure. I don't know if you know it or not, but the Old Testament temple and the tabernacle always had a place for the Gentiles to worship. God has never been anti-Gentile. There was actually a courtyard, both for the tabernacle and for the temple, that a Gentile could come and worship God at. Now, he couldn't go to the inside courts, and he couldn't go to the place where the altar was. But if a Gentile wanted to worship God, he could come and he worship God. I suspect, I can't prove this because it doesn't say it in the Bible, but I suspect if he had a sacrifice, they probably had somebody, a runner, maybe a young Jewish boy, or maybe a priest's son, who would take that sacrifice up to the priest so that that sacrifice for that Gentile could be offered. Don't know that, but the point being, there was a place where even a Gentile could come and worship God. It was the courtyard of the Gentiles. That's what he's referring to here in this verse. God's given the command to John, I want you to measure the temple, I want you to measure the people that are worshiping there, I want you to measure the altar, but I don't want you to measure this outside courtyard. Why? Because it's given unto that's the Gentiles' place. Now that's a little bit odd. Why wouldn't God want to measure that too? I don't know. Maybe he's just wanting to emphasize right now that the Jews are worshiping here. But that's not the only statement that he makes. It's the rest of the statement that he makes that really ought to get our attention. Notice the last part of verse number 2. He says, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months. Now that's a big statement. He's got us thinking about the temple, and now all of a sudden he slides in here a little bit of truth about the holy city. Well, what is the holy city? The holy city is always Jerusalem. It's the holy city because that's the place where the Son of God walked. It's the holy city because that's the place where the Son of God was arrested. It's the holy city because that's the place where he was tried. It's the holy city because that's the place where just outside of this city they crucified him. That's the holy city because just outside the walls of this city, they buried him. It's the holy city because just outside the walls of this city, on the third day, he arose again. It's the holy city because just across the creek from this city, on the Mount of Olives, that's the place that he ascended from. And it's the holy city because one of these days, that's the place he's returning to. There is no spot on this globe as holy as the city of Jerusalem. It's the holy city. But he's telling us something that's going to happen to the holy city. He says, I don't want you to measure that outside court because it belongs to the Gentiles. And then in the same breath he says, and they shall trample it underfoot for 42 months. Who's the they? Well, who's he been talking about? Gentiles. It's the Gentile court. Don't measure it. It belongs to the Gentiles. And they're going to trample not the temple, but the whole holy city underfoot. Not just for a day, a week, or a month, but for 42 months. Now, sometimes I wonder whether I should say what comes to my mind or whether I shouldn't. Jews aren't like Americans. Jews don't let people trample their cities underfoot. They don't let people riot and loot and pillage and burn. First time I ever went to Israel was 2008. I got off the plane at the airport. We're being shuttled out to a bus. And as I'm walking out to the bus, there's an armed female soldier, camouflage, with I don't know what kind of assault rifle, whatever is the technologically advanced assault rifle, sitting on her hip, and she's talking on her phone. And I'm saying to myself, I'm not in Kansas anymore. I mean, this is what's normal. You're driving through the streets of the city, and you see three or four, and they're all young folks. They've got mandatory consignment. When you get 18, you have to serve. So these are like 18, 19, 20, and 22 year. And maybe our kids are over here looting, and we got good kids. I'm not saying we don't, but we've got kids perhaps doing some wild things. These kids are all military trained, carrying armed weapons, and they're walking the street. They don't put up with people acting foolish over in the land of Israel. For anybody to trample the city of Jerusalem underfoot for 42 months, they're going to have to conquer the Jews. They're going to have to oppress the Jews. They're going to have to put down the Jews. Now, this little verse is telling us something about a major event. For 42 months, Gentiles are going to, by the way, the word trample, you can't make that sound good. That means to stomp on. That means to walk all over. That's a disrespectful thing. For 42 months, Gentiles are going to stomp all over God's holy city. Might I tell you that Jesus also prophesied this? One of the interesting things that makes Old Testament, prophecy study a little bit difficult is tying all the different Bible verses together. But Jesus prophesied this very event in the book of Luke chapter 21, verse number 24. Luke 21, 24. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive unto all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Do you catch the similar phrases? Trodden down. He's connecting this prophecy with that prophecy. Jesus just said it's the times of the Gentiles. Now from the book of Revelation chapter 11 verse number 2, we know how long the times of the Gentiles are going to last. It's going to last for 42 months. But we also know a little bit more about what's going to happen. What are these Gentiles going to do to the Jews? Listen to the first part of that verse again. And they, the Jews, shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive unto all nations. There's yet to be a time for 42 months where Gentiles are going to march through the streets of Jerusalem and going to slay their people. Where Gentiles are going to march through the streets of Jerusalem and capture their people and sell them as slaves and bondmen to all parts of the world. This is a prophesied event. Question: what 42 months are we talking about? He uses the term 42 months. How long is this time of the Gentiles going to last? It's going to last for 42 months, 3.5 years. What 3.5 years are we talking about? Well, the Bible never flatly, plainly declares the answer to that question. But let's see if we can't figure it out. Number one, let's see if we can't figure out about where we are in the book of Revelation. Now, in the years that I've been a Christian, I've noticed that most preachers don't think that the book of Revelation is in chronological order. And I've never really figured out why they don't think that. As I read through the book of Revelation, to me it seems like it's in perfect chronological order. Now, sometimes John will start a story and he'll go ahead and finish that story, and then he'll come back and pick up where he left off at and go forward. But we do that in conversation. If I were to talk to you about the history of the Green Pond Baptist Church, just like I did a few moments ago, or our history, I might tell you how it all ended. Well, we were up there for a couple of years, and I think what stopped it, not for sure, but I think Kathy got pregnant again. I don't know how that happened. But we finally decided, well, five kids were just too much at 12 midnight to go to a radio station and stay up at 3 a.m. So we quit going during that. But the reason you do something like that, the reason you start a story and finish it is so that it makes sense. And so John sometimes in this book, he'll start something and then he'll go ahead and finish it, but he comes right back to where he left off at and he picks the story back up again. And then sometimes he gives the background, just like I did. She mentions us going up there, having the ministry. I said, well, that happened 30 years ago. Brother Jack LeGrand invited us. So we back up and we give the history. But when we finish the story, we come right back to where we were and we pick up again. That's all John does. Sometimes he goes backwards in time to tell us something. Sometimes he goes forward in time to tell us something. But overall, I see no reason not to think that he's writing a common sense book. From beginning to end, it's in chronological order. Well, where are we in this book? Well, we're getting close to the middle of the tribulation. How long does the tribulation last? 7 years. If we're at the middle, how long is left? 3.5 years. So what 42 months is he probably speaking about? Well, probably pretty much the last 42 of them. Now maybe we're still a month or two on this side of the halfway mark. But by and large, we're talking about the last 42 months. If the book of Revelation is a book that's in chronological order, and I see no reason not to think that it is. But let's go a little bit further in our thinking. I already talked to you about Daniel chapter number 9, verse number 27. That's the verse that tells us how long the tribulation is going to last. A period of 7. I think a period of 7 years. We also found out that halfway in that time period, the Antichrist who makes a treaty with Israel will break it. Well, now let's think for a moment. The Antichrist is an aspiring world leader. The first 3.5 years, he's trying to put together a coalition. He wants to rule the world. He makes a treaty with Israel. He gives them back their temple. He wants to be their buddy. He wants to be their friend. The first 3.5 years, I don't see him letting a Gentile army go and beat up on the nation of Israel. I mean, if you want them to be your friends, you don't want them to get beat up. You protect them. So the first 3.5 years, it makes sense. He's made a treaty with them. He's going to do his best to protect the nation of Israel. He's not going to let his army's not going to go in. And he's not going to let somebody else's army go in. But we know halfway through the tribulation, Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, that the Antichrist himself breaks the treaty with Israel. Why do you break a treaty? Something got you mad. Something got you upset. I mean, you got ticked off. Well, wait a minute. Who are we talking about? We're talking about the Antichrist. If you tick off the Antichrist, what do you think he might do to you? I think he might send an army in after you. I think he might kill some of you. And I think he might sell some of you as slaves and put you in jail. Something big happens around the middle of the tribulation. What is that thing that happens? I think the Antichrist gets very angry with the Jews. And I believe the time of the Gentiles is the Antichrist moving his army into Jerusalem and wreaking havoc on the land of Israel. 2 weeks ago, I was preaching on Daniel chapter number 9. And we were talking about that army of 200 million. I told you there's several possibilities for what that could be. I told you one of the possibilities was it could be the Antichrist army. I really don't think that's what it is, but it could be. And we went back and we looked at Daniel chapter number 11. And I know I'm tying a lot of different Bible verses in here. I've preached on all these Bible verses already. But in Daniel chapter number 9, Daniel chapter number 11, Daniel is given a prophecy about a Greek king that was going to come from the north down to the south, from Syria down to Egypt to fight the Egyptians. And that prophecy has already come to pass, so we know who he was. The name of that king was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, if any of you are pregnant and you want a name to name your child that nobody else is using, I think that's probably it right there. Antiochus IV. The fourth means there was three others of them. Don't get that. I guess you got to be Greek to appreciate that name. But Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He lived. He was a king. He came down. He tried to fight Egypt. Didn't go well. He went back up into the land of Israel, and he took his anger out on the Jews. He desecrated their temple. He offered pigs on their altar. He slew he slew all the priests. He slew every Jew that he came across. What Jew he didn't slay, he sold him into slavery. The strange thing is, when you read Daniel chapter number 11, you read about this prophecy, you sense immediately he's not just talking about this one guy. This guy is a type of the Antichrist. And I told you then that what he did in a small fashion, the Antichrist is going to do in a big fashion. One of these days, the Antichrist is going to come through Jerusalem. And I'm not sure what's going to tick him off completely, but I know what he's going to do. He's going to desecrate the temple of God. He's going to do his best to kill every Jew, to imprison every Jew. As a matter of fact, Jesus prophesied this too. I won't take the time to read it, but make you a note in your margin. Matthew chapter 24, beginning at verse number 15. Jesus called it the abomination of desolations. He said, you Jews, when you see the abomination of desolations, don't even bother going back into your house to pack your suitcase. You start running for the mountains. He said, don't stop, don't slow down. You get up into the mountains and you hide yourself. Why? Because the Antichrist is going to come in with fury like a storm. And he's going to slay, and he's going to kill, and he's going to desecrate. How long will it last? Revelation 11, 2, 3, and 1/2 years. What time period? I think it's going to be the last half of the tribulation. Many of you thought the first half was bad. Meteorites falling from the sky, polluting the water. Armies of who knows what creatures coming out of the pits of this earth, stinging you with torments and causing you to suffer in pain for 5 months. If you thought the first half of the tribulation was bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. Wait till there's a king who's an absolute monarch, and he's got a large army where he can go and hunt you down and kill you just because you're a Jew or just because you're a Christian. That's what makes the last part of the tribulation exceptionally worse. It's not just the tribulation now. It's the great tribulation. Now you see, here's the problem. I could talk for hours because it's very interesting to me what's going to happen. But let me give you one more thing and then I'll hush. What do you suppose is going to tick the Antichrist off so that he breaks his treaty with Israel? And instead of trying to be their buddy, then becomes their worst enemy, their worst nightmare. I think the Bible tells us. You take your Bible, go to the book of 2 Thessalonians, chapter number 2. 2 Thessalonians, chapter number 2. Look at the last few words of verse number 3. 2 Thessalonians, chapter 2, verse number 3. He's talking about, and that's why I want you to read these last few words. He's talking about the son of perdition. That's the devil. That's the Antichrist. The son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. He's describing the Antichrist here. He's talking about the Antichrist, and guess what else he's talking about? A temple. There hadn't been a temple on this planet for the Jews in 2,000 years. Hadn't been a temple on this planet since the year 70 AD. But now there's a temple. And now there's an Antichrist. And at some point, this Antichrist is going to go into that temple, And he's going to proclaim to the Jews, I am God. He's not going to say, I'm just any God. He's going to say, I'm your God. I'm the Jehovah that brought you out of Egypt. I'm the Jehovah that protected you, that gave you this land. I am the Jehovah God. The Antichrist is going to have the audacity, the arrogance, the foolish pride to stand in the temple of the Jews and say, I am your God. And I think at that moment, God's going to turn the light on in the Jewish spirit. And they're going to understand he's not our God. And in that moment, they're going to reject him. They're going to reject the Antichrist. Could I tell you, I think that's what he does in the middle of the tribulation. I think that's when he feels like he's done them enough favors. He's given them a temple. He's protected them. He's been gracious to them. 3.5 years into this tribulation, and now he marches himself up, sits himself down on a throne and says, let me just tell you who I've always been. I've always been your God. And I think the Jews are going to turn on him with such a fierceness that it will anger him to no end, and he will break that treaty, and for the next 42 months, he will slay and slaughter and abominate and desecrate everything that's holy in that city. These 3 Bible verses are about 3 measurements. John, go measure the temple. The time of the Gentiles will last for 42 months. And the time of ministry for the 2 witnesses, 1,260 days. 3 measurements. You know what's really interesting? If I had stood to preach this very same message 75 years ago, I'd have been laughed at because there was no temple and there was no nation of Israel. Today, I can preach it and you say, hey, I see how that could happen. You and I are living closer and closer to the final fulfillment of every Bible prophecy. Just 20 years ago, if I had told you they've got an RF chip that they could implant in you, and no matter where you go in this world, they'd be able to identify you, you would have laughed. You'd have said, preacher, they got no such technology. You realize they didn't even invent the computer chip to the 1980s. Many of us were alive in the 1980s. You remember the old analog clocks? I mean, they didn't have digital anything. You had to actually get up and go flip the switch because nothing was. But now we understand why we're that much closer to these prophecies being fulfilled. If you have never trusted Jesus Christ as your Savior, or if you have and are not living for Jesus Christ, you need to get saved and get right with Jesus today. Would you bow with me in prayer? Father, I thank you for the opportunity to preach. I thank you for the people who have been very patient. Some of what I have said, they probably have not understood. But God, I do pray that you would open up our spirits and our hearts to help us to see that what's taking place every single day in the world around us is an indication that the time is drawing close. Now, God, if there's somebody in this place, the parking lot, the big fellowship hall, watching on Facebook, however they may be viewing this, who's not saved, I pray that your Spirit would reach out to them and show them that you died on the cross for them. And help them, God, not just to believe in their head, but to surrender their heart and their life to you. May souls be saved. May eternities be changed. And we'll give you the praise for what you do, for we ask it in Jesus' name. With you.